For stones there is no life after death. There is none for anyone to whom it has been promised and granted, after death, to become a plant or animal. What would happen if I died and all my atoms were recomposed, after my flesh was well distributed in the earth and filtered through roots, into the lovely shape of a palm tree? Would I say I palm? The palm would say it, no less thinking than a stone. But when the palm says I, will it mean I, Roberto? It would be wrong to deprive it of the right to say I palm. For what sort of palm would it be if it said I, Roberto, am palm? That composite able to say I, Roberto, because it perceived itself as that composite, is no longer. And if it is no longer, having lost that perception, it has lost also the memory of itself. It cannot even say I, palm, was Roberto. For if such memory were possible, I should now know that I, Roberto, was at one time, what? Something. But I have absolutely no such memory. What I was before, I no longer know, just as I am incapable of remembering that fetus I was in my mother's womb. I know I was a fetus because others have told me so, but as far as I am concerned, I might never have been it. My God, I could enjoy the soul, and even the stones could enjoy it, and precisely from the soul of stones I learned that my soul will not survive my body. Why am I thinking and playing at being a stone, when afterwards I will know nothing further of myself? But in the final analysis, what is this I that I believe thinks me? Have I not said that it is only the awareness that the void, identical to extension, has of itself in this particular composite? Therefore I am not I who thinks, but I am the void, or extension, that thinks me. And so this composite is an accident, in which void and extension linger for the blink of an eye, to be able afterwards to return to thinking otherwise. In this great void of the void, the one thing that truly is the history of this evolution in numberless transitory compositions. Compositions of what? Of the one great nothingness, which is the substance of the whole. Substance governed by a majestic necessity, which leads it to create and destroy worlds, to weave our pale lives. I must accept this, succeed in loving this necessity, return to it, and bow to its future will, for this is the condition of happiness. Only by accepting its law will I find my freedom. To flow back into it will be salvation, fleeing from passions into the sole passion, the intellectual love of God. If I truly succeeded in understanding this, I would be the one man who has found the true philosophy, and I would know everything about the God that is hidden. But who would have the heart to go about the world and proclaim such a philosophy? This is the secret I will carry with me to my grave, in the Antipodes. As I have said before, Roberto did not have the makings of a philosopher. Having achieved this epiphany, which he polished with the severity of an optician grinding a lens, he experienced, once more, an amorous apostasy. Since stones do not love, he sat up, again a loving man. But then, he said to himself, if to the great sea of the great and sole substance we must all return, down below or up above, or wherever it is, I will be united, identical, with my lady. We will both be part and all of the same macrocosm. I will be she will be I. Is this not the deepest meaning of the myth of the hermaphrodite? Lilia and I, one body and one thought. But have I not foretold this event? For days, weeks, months, I have been making her live in a world that is all mine, even if through Ferrandi. She has already thought of my thought. Perhaps conceiving romances means living through our own characters, making them live in our world, and delivering ourselves and our creatures to the minds of those to come, even when we will no longer be able to say I. But if this is so, it is up to me alone to banish Ferrandi from my own world, forever, to have his banishment governed by divine justice, and to create the conditions whereby I can be united with Lilia. Filled with renewed enthusiasm, Roberto decided to conceive the last chapter of his story. He did not know that, especially when their authors are now determined to die, stories often write themselves, and go where they want to go. Chapter 38. An Enquiry into the Nature and Place of Hell. Roberto told himself how Ferrandi, wandering from island to island and seeking more his pleasure than the correct course, refused to be instructed by the warnings evident in the signals the eunuch sent to Biscarat's wound, and finally he lost all notion of where he was. The ship meanwhile sailed on, the inadequate provisions spoiled, the water began to stink. To keep the crew in ignorance, Ferrandi decreed that each man go below only once a day to the hold and in the darkness take the minimum supplies required for survival, and no one was to look around there. Lilia realized nothing, for she bore every torment with serenity and seemed to thrive on a drop of water and a crumb of biscuit, anxious for her beloved to succeed in his enterprise. As for Ferrandi, insensitive to that love except for the pleasure he drew from it, he went on inciting his mariners, flashing images of wealth before the eyes of their greed. And so a blind man blinded by rancor led other blind men blinded by avidity, holding prisoner in his fetters a blind beauty. Still, many of the crew, in their great thirst, felt their gums begin to swell and cover their teeth. Their legs became spotted with abscesses, and their pestilential secretion rose even to their vital parts. So it was that, sailing below the 25th degree of latitude south, Ferrandi had to face a mutiny. He quelled it, relying on a group of 5 corsairs, the most faithful, Andropod, Boride, Ordonia, Soffer, and Asprando, and the mutineers were set adrift in the sloop with a few victuals. But in so doing, the Tweed Daphne had deprived itself of a means of rescue. What does that matter, Ferrandi said, soon we will be in the place to which we are lured by our cursed hunger for gold. But the men remaining were too few to sail the ship. Nor did they wish to. Having lent a hand to their chief, they now considered themselves his equals. One of the five had spied on that mysterious young gentleman who came up on deck so rarely, and discovered he was a woman. Then those cutthroats confronted Ferranti, demanding the passenger. Ferranti, Adonis of aspect but Vulcan at heart, set more store by Pluto than by Venus, and it was fortunate Lilia did not hear him when in a murmur he assured the mutinous five that he would reach an agreement with them. Roberto could not permit Ferranti to carry out this final villainy. He then chose to have Neptune become enraged that mortals had traversed his domain without fear of his wrath. Or else, rather than put the story in such pagan as well as fanciful terms, he imagined it was impossible, if a romance must also convey a moral lesson, that heaven would not punish that vessel of perfidies. And he rejoiced imagining that the austral winds, with Boreas and Eurus, staunch enemies of the calm of the sea, even if till now they had left to the placid zephyrs the responsibility of following the path along which the Tweed Daphne continued her voyage, were beginning to show signs of impatience in the confinement of their subterranean chambers. He made them burst forth all at once. The groan of the timbers covered the ground base of the sailors' lamentations, the sea vomited upon them and they vomited into the sea, and sometimes a wave so enfolded them that from the shore one might have mistaken that deck for a coffin of ice, around which the thunderbolts flared like wax tapers. At first the storm set clouds against clouds, waters against waters, winds against winds. But soon the sea abandoned its prescribed limits and grew, swelling, towards the sky, and rain came pouring down, the water mixed with the air, the birds learning to swim and the fish to fly. It was no longer a struggle of nature against the seamen but a battle of the elements among themselves. Not one atom of air swirled but that it was not transformed into a pellet of hail, and Neptune rose to extinguish the fire in Jove's hands, to rob him of the pleasure of burning those humans whom Neptune wanted instead to drown. The sea dug a grave in its own bosom to rob the earth of them, and Neptune, seeing the vessel heading uncontrolled towards a rock, with a sudden slap sent it off in another direction. The ship was immersed, stern and prow, and every time it dipped, it seemed to fly from the top of a tower. The poop sank until the gallery was swamped, and at the prow the waves were bent on engulfing the bowsprit. Andropod, who was trying to secure a sail, was torn from the yardarm and, plunging into the sea, struck Boride as he was pulling a hawser and broke his neck. The hull refused to obey Ordonia the helmsman, while another gust abruptly tore away the mizzen topsail. Soffer tried hard to furl the sails, urged on by Ferranti's curses, but he could not finish lashing the crow's nest before the ship swung around and its flank received 3 waves of such dimensions that Soffer was washed overboard. The mainmast shattered and plunged into the sea, not without having first devastated the deck and crushed Asprando's skull. And finally the tiller broke to pieces as with a wild blow it took the life of Ordonia. Now this wooden relic was without a crew, and the last rats poured overboard, falling into the water they wanted to escape. It seems impossible that Ferranti, in such a witch's Sabbath, should think of Lilia, for we would expect him to be concerned only with his own safety. I cannot say whether Roberto considered he was violating the laws of verisimilitude, but to make sure that she to whom he had given his heart did not perish, he had to grant a heart also to Ferranti, if only for an instant. So Ferranti drags Lilia up on deck, and what does he do? Experience has taught Roberto to have Ferranti bind her fast to a plank, allowing her to slip into the sea, trusting that not even the wild beasts of the deep will deny mercy to such beauty. After which, Ferranti seizes another piece of wood, preparing to tie it to himself. But at that moment, onto the deck, freed in some unknown fashion from his torment by the upheaval of the hold, his hands still chained together, more like a corpse than a living man but with eyes alive with hate, steps Biscarat. Biscarat, who throughout the voyage has remained, like the dog on the Amaryllis, suffering in bonds as every day they reopen that wound which is then briefly treated. Biscarat, who has passed these months with a single thought, to avenge himself upon Ferranti. Deus ex machina. Biscarat appears suddenly behind Ferranti, who already has 1 foot on the bulwarks. The officer raises his arms and brings them down before Ferranti's face, his chain making a noose at Ferranti's throat. And shouting, "With me, to hell at last." Biscarat is seen, almost felt, giving such a tug at Ferranti's neck that it breaks as the tongue protrudes between those blasphemous lips and accompanies their final rage. Then the lifeless body of the executed man, falling, drags after it like a cloak the still living body of his executioner, who, victorious, meets the warring waves with peace finally in his heart. Roberto could not imagine Lilia's feelings at that sight, and he hoped she had seen nothing. Since he could not remember what had happened to him after he was caught in the maelstrom, he could not imagine what now happened to her. The truth is, he was so fully occupied by the duty to send Ferranti to his proper punishment, resolving to follow his fate into the next world, that he left Lilia in the vast upheaval. The lifeless body of Ferranti had meanwhile been cast up on a desert island. The sea was calm, like the water in a cup, and on the shore there was no surf. All was enveloped in a light haze, as happens when the sun has just disappeared and the night has not yet taken possession of the sky. Immediately beyond the beach, with no trees or bushes to mark its end, a plain could be seen, totally mineral, where even what from the distance seemed cypresses proved to be leaden obelisks. On the horizon to the west rose a mountainous area, now dark to the view except for some flickering along the slopes, which gave the place the aspect of a cemetery. But above that height lay long black clouds, their bellies like dying coals, solid and compact in form, are like those cuttlefish bones seen in certain paintings or drawings, which if you look at them sideways freeze into the shape of skulls. Between the clouds and the mountain, the sky still had some tinges of yellow, and you would have thought it was the last aerial space touched by the dying sun if it were not for the impression that this last burst of sunset had never had a beginning and would never have an end. Where the plane began to rise, Ferranti could make out a little band of men, and he moved towards them. Men, or, in any case, human beings. They seemed from the distance, but as Ferranti reached them, he saw that if they had once been human, now they had become, or were on the way to becoming, exhibits for an anatomy theater. Which is how Roberto wanted them, because he recalled having visited one day one of those places where a group of physicians in dark clothes, with rubicund faces, little veins glowing on nostrils and cheeks, in pose like so many executioners, stood around a cadaver to expound from the outside what there was inside, and to reveal in the dead the secrets of the living. They removed the skin, incised the flesh, bared the bones, separated the bundles of nerves, untangled the knotted muscles, opened the organs of the senses, isolated all the membranes, undid all the cartilages, detached all the entrails. Having distinguished every fiber, opened every artery, probed every marrow, they displayed to their audience the vital workshop. Here, they said, is where the food is digested, here the blood cleansed, alimentation distributed here humors formed, here spirits tempered. And someone next to Roberto observed in a whisper that after our terrestrial death, nature would do much the same to us. An anatomist god had, in a different way, touched those inhabitants of the island, whom Ferranti was now seeing closer and closer. The first was a body without skin, the ropes of muscle taut, the arms in a gesture of abandonment, the suffering face turned heavenwards, all skull and cheekbones. The hands of the second had flayed skin hanging from its fingertips, barely attached, like a glove, and the skin of the legs was rolled up to the knee like a supple boot. On the next, first the skin, then the muscles had been so splayed that the whole body, especially the face, seemed an open book. As if to show skin, flesh, and bones at the same time, thrice human and thrice mortal. It seemed an insect, of which those tatters would have been the wings if there had been on that island a wind to stir them. But these wings did not move by any impulse of the air, stagnant in that twilight. They barely shifted at the movements of the body, akimbo. Nearby, a skeleton was leaning on a spade, perhaps to dig its grave, its eye sockets peering at the sky. A grimace on the crooked arc of the teeth, the left hand held out as if to beg for compassion and a hearing. Another skeleton, bent forward, proffered the curved back of its spine, walking in jerks, bony hands over a lowered face. One, whom Ferranti also saw only from behind, still had some cropped hair on its fleshless skull, like a cap pulled forcibly over it. The felt lining, pale and pink as a seashell, which sustained the fur, was formed by the cutest slit at the nape and turned inside out. There were bodies from which almost everything had been removed, and they seemed sculptures of nerves alone. On the stumps of necks, now acephalous, they waved what once had clung to brains. The legs seemed a play of widths. There were others with abdomens opened, where saffron intestines throbbed, sad gluttons stuffed with ill-digested tripes. Where once penises had been, now peeled and reduced to pegs, only dried-up testicles swayed. Ferranti saw some who were now only veins and arteries, the mobile laboratory of an alchemist, pipes and tubes in perpetual motion distilling the bloodless blood, wan fireflies in the light of an absent sun. The bodies stood in great and painful silence. In some the signs could be seen of a very slow transformation that from statues of flesh was reducing them to statues of fibers. The last of them, excoriated like a Saint Bartholomew, held up in his right hand his still bleeding skin limp as an unused cape. It was possible yet to recognize a face there, with the holes of the eyes and nostrils and the cavern of the mouth, which seemed the ultimate melting of a wax mask, dripping, exposed to sudden heat. And that man, or rather, the toothless and deformed mouth of his skin, spoke to Ferranti. "Ill come," he said to him, "to the land of the dead, which we call Insula Visalia. Soon you, too, will follow our fate, but you must not believe that we all pass with the rapidity granted by the grave. According to our punishment, each of us is led to a stage of disintegration all his own, as if to allow us to savor extinction, which for each of us would be the greatest joy. Oh, what bliss, to imagine ourselves as brains that would turn to pulp at a bare touch, fats liquefying. But no, as you see us, we have come, each, to his present state without being aware of it, through imperceptible mutation during which every fiber of our being has been worn away in the course of thousands of years. And no one knows the extreme point to which it is decreed he must decay, so that those you see over there, reduced to mere bones, still hope to be able to die a little, and perhaps they have spent millennia in that expectation. Others, like me, have been in this form since we no longer know when, because in this always imminent night we have lost all sense of time's passage, and yet I hope that I have been granted a very slow annihilation. Thus each of us yearns for a decomposition that, as well we know, will never be total. We wish that for us eternity has not yet begun, yet we fear that we have been in it ever since our remote arrival on this shore. Living, we believed hell was the place of eternal despair, because so they told us. Alas, no, for it is the place of undying hope, which makes each day worse than the one before, as this thirst, which is kept alive in us, is never slaked. Having always a glimmer of body, and every body tending to growth or to death, we never cease hoping, and thus did our judge condemn us to suffer in Secula. Ferranti asked, But what is it that you hope for? You might as well ask what you will hope for yourself. You will hope that a wisp of wind, a slightest swell of the tide, the arrival of a single hungry leech, can return us, atom by atom, to the great void of the universe, where we would again somehow participate in the cycle of life. But here the air does not stir, the sea remains motionless, we feel neither heat nor cold, we know neither dawn nor sunset, and this earth, more dead than we, generates no animal life. O worms that death once promised us! O beloved little worms, mothers of our spirit that could still be reborn! Sucking our bile, you would spatter us mercifully with the milk of innocence. Biting us, you would heal the bites of our sins. Cradling us with your spells of death, you would give us new life, because for us the grave is as good as the maternal womb. But none of this will happen. We know it, and yet our body forgets it at every instant. And God? Ferranti asked. Does God laugh? No, alas, the excoriated man replied, because even humiliation would exalt us. How beautiful it would be if we could see at least a laughing God come to taunt us. What distraction, the spectacle of the Lord who from his throne, among his saints, makes sport of us. We would have the sight of another's joy, as cheering as the sight of another's frown. No, here no one is outraged, no one laughs, no one shows himself. God is not here. Here there is only hope without goal. My God, a curse on all saints, Ferranti wanted to shout, in his villainy. If I am damned, I must have the right to enact the spectacle of my fury. But his body was spent, and the voice that came from his bosom faint. He could not even curse. You see, the skinned man said to him, his mouth unable to smile, your punishment has already begun. Not even hatred is permitted anymore. This island is the one place in the universe where pain is not allowed, where listless hope cannot be distinguished from a bottomless boredom. Roberto went on constructing Ferranti's end as he lay on the deck naked, for he had stripped himself for his imitation of a stone, and in the meanwhile the sun burned his face, chest, and legs, restoring to him the feverish warmth that had only recently left him. Now prepared to confuse not only his fiction with reality but also the heat of his spirit with that of his body, he felt once more ablaze with love. And Lilia? What had happened to Lilia while Ferranti's cadaver sought out the Isle of the Dead? With a device not uncommon among poets when they are incapable of restraining their impatience and no longer observe the unities of time and place, Roberto leapt over some events to find Lilia again some days later, clinging to that plank as it drifted over a now calm sea glittering in the sun, and she approached, and this, dear reader, you never would have dared predict, the eastern shore of the island of Solomon, that is to say, the side opposite the one off which the Daphne rode at anchor. There, as Roberto had learned from Father Casper, the beaches were less friendly than those to the west. The plank, by now too fragile to withstand an impact, shattered against a rock. Lilia woke and clung to that rock as the fragments of her raft were lost among the currents. Now she was there, on a rock that could barely house her, as a stretch of water, but for her it was an ocean, separated her from the shore. Shaken by the typhoon, wasted by hunger, tormented even more by thirst, she could not drag herself from the rock to the sand, beyond which, her vision blurred, she discerned the colors of vegetable forms. But the rock was searing beneath her tender thigh and, hardly breathing, instead of cooling her inner blaze, she drew the burning air into herself. She hoped that not far away darting little streams would spring from shady cliffs, yet these dreams did not appease but, rather, exacerbated her thirst. She wanted to ask help of heaven, but as her dry tongue cleaved to her palate, her voice could utter only abbreviated sighs. As time passed, the scourge of the wind scratched her with a raptor's claws, and she feared not so much dying as living until the work of the elements had disfigured her, making her an object of revulsion, no longer one of love. If she could have reached a brook, a trickle of living water, and put her lips to it, she would have seen her eyes, once two bright stars that promised life, now two frightful eclipses, and that countenance, where jesting cupids once made their home, now the horrid dwelling place of abhorrence. If she could have actually reached a pond, her eyes would have poured out, in pity for her own state, more drops than her lips would have taken from it. This at least is what Roberto made Lilia think. But it irritated him. He was irritated that, close to death, she should be in anguish over her own beauty, as romances often would have it, but his irritation was more with himself, who could not look squarely, without mental hyperboles, at the face of his dying love. How would Lilia be, really, in that extremity? How would she appear if stripped of that dress of death woven from words? After the sufferings of her long voyage in the wreck, her hair would be straw-streaked with white. Her bosom would surely have lost its lilies, her face would be furrowed by time. Wrinkled, now, her throat and breast. No, to celebrate her fading was another way of entrusting himself to the poetic machine of Padre Emanuele. Roberto wanted to see Lilia as she truly was. Her head thrown back, her eyes staring and, narrowed by suffering, appearing to be too distant from the bridge of her nose, now sharpened. And those same eyes were weighed down with bags, the corners marked by a fan of little wrinkles, prints left by a sparrow on the sand. Nostrils slightly dilated, one more fleshy than the other. The mouth chapped, of amethyst color, 2 arcs at the sides, and the upper lip, a bit protruding, raised to display 2 little teeth no longer of ivory. The skin of the face gently sagging, 2 limp folds under the chin, detracting from the line of the neck. And yet this withered fruit was a prize he would not have bartered for all the angels of heaven. He loved her also like this, nor could he know if she had been different when he first loved her, wanting her as she was then, behind the curtain of her black veil, that distant evening. He had allowed himself to be misled during his time as a castaway, wanting her to be harmonious, like the system of the spheres. But now they had also told him, and he had not dared confess this, too, to Father Casper, that perhaps the planets did not pursue their journey along the perfect line of a circle but instead in a strabismic turn around the sun. If beauty is clear, love is mysterious. He discovered that he loved not only the spring but all the seasons of his beloved. She was even more desirable in her autumnal decline. He had always loved her for what she was and could have been, and only in this sense is love a giving of the self, without anticipation of return. He had allowed himself to be dazed by his wave-pounding exile, seeking always another self, dreadful in Ferrante, excellent in Lilia, through whose glory he had wanted to make himself glorious. But, to love Lilia meant to want her as he himself was, both of them sentenced to the travail of time. Until now he had used her beauty to foster the soiling of his mind. He had made her speak, putting into her mouth the words he wanted, words with which he was nevertheless discontent. Now he wanted her near, to love her suffering beauty, her wan voluptuousness, her bruised grace, her thin nakedness, to caress all eagerly, listening to her words, her own, not the ones he had lent her. He had to have her, dispossessing himself of himself. But it was too late to pay proper homage to his sick idol. On the other side of the island, in Lilia's veins, liquefied, flowed death. Chapter 39. Itinerarium ecstaticum coeleste. Was this any way to end a romance? Not only do romances arouse hatred so that we may finally relish the defeat of those we hate, but also they invite compassion in order to lead us then to discover, when the danger is over, those we love. Roberto had never read a romance that ended so badly. Unless this romance was not yet finished, and there was a secret hero in store, capable of a feat conceivable only in the land of romances. Out of love, Roberto decided to perform that feat, entering the story himself. If I had arrived at the island by now, he said to himself, I could save her. It is only my indolence that has kept me here. Now we are both anchored in the sea, desiring the opposite shores of a single body of land. And yet not all is lost. I see her dying at this moment, but if at this same moment I were to reach the island, I would be there a day before she arrives, waiting for her, ready to rescue her. It is of little matter that I draw her from the sea when she is on the point of breathing her last. It is a known fact that when the body reaches that stage, a strong emotion can restore it to new vigor, and there have been cases of the dying who, on learning that the cause of their misfortune has been removed, suddenly reanimate. And what greater emotion, for that dying woman, than to rediscover, alive, the beloved person? In fact, I would not even have to reveal to her that I am different from the one she loved, because it was to me and not to him that she gave herself. I would simply be taking the place that has been my due from the beginning. And what is more, Lilia, without realizing it, would sense a different love in my gaze, free of all lust, trembling with devotion. Is it possible, as anyone would ask himself, that Roberto had not reflected on the fact that this rescue would be granted him only if he were to reach the island within that day, or at most by the early hours of the following morning? An exploit that his most recent experiments hardly made probable. Is it possible he did not realize that he was planning to land in reality on the island to rescue a woman who was arriving there only through his narrative? But Roberto, as we have seen, having begun with the idea that the land of romances was completely separate from his own world, had finally come to make the two universes flow effortlessly one into the other, and he had mingled their laws. He thought that he could arrive at the island because he was imagining his arrival, and that he could imagine hers at the moment when he was already there, because this was what he wished. On the other hand, he was transferring to his own world that freedom to will events and to see them achieved which makes romances unpredictable. Finally, he would reach the island for the simple reason that if he did not reach it, he would no longer know what story to tell. Around this idea, which anyone who has not followed us thus far would judge mad or madness, as you also may, he now reflected in a mathematical fashion, not hiding from himself any of the eventualities that intelligence and prudence suggested. As a general defines, the night before the battle, the movements his troops will execute on the coming day, and not only pictures the difficulties that could arise and the accidents that could disturb his plan, but also plumbs the mind of the opposing general, to foresee his actions and counteractions, and to arrange his future by acting in consequence of what the other might arrange in consequence of those consequences. So Roberto weighed means and ends, causes and effects, pros and cons. He had to abandon the idea of swimming to the reef and passing it. He could no longer see the submerged passages, and he could not reach the part that emerged except by facing invisible traps, surely mortal. And finally, even assuming he could reach it, whether underwater or on the surface, there was no certainty he could walk on it with his makeshift boots, or that it did not conceal pits into which he would fall, never to reappear. He could therefore reach the island only by repeating the course of the boat, that is, by swimming southwards, following the shore at a distance, more or less at the Daphne's distance, then turning east once he had rounded the southern promontory until he gained the inlet of which Father Casper had spoken. This plan was not reasonable, and for two reasons. First, until now he had barely managed to swim as far as the reef, and at that point his strength was already exhausted, so it was not sensible to think he could cover a distance at least 4 or 5 times that, and without rope, not so much because he did not have a rope that long but because this time, if he went, it was to go, for if he did not arrive, it would make no sense to turn back. The second reason was that swimming southwards meant moving against the current, and knowing by now that his strength sufficed to fight it for only a few strokes, he would be inexorably pulled to the north, beyond the other cape, farther and farther from the island. After sternly calculating these possibilities, admitting that life was short, art long, opportunity instantaneous and experiment uncertain, he told himself that it was unworthy of a gentleman to be daunted by such petty calculations, like a bourgeois computing the odds he had in staking a dice his greedily hoarded wealth. To be sure, he then said, a calculation must be made, but it must be sublime, if the stakes are sublime. What was he gambling in this wager? His life. But his life, if he never succeeded in leaving the ship, was worth little, especially now, if his solitude was accompanied by the knowledge that he had lost her forever. What would he win if he came through the test? Everything. The joy of seeing her again and saving her, or at worst, of dying on her dead body, covering it with a shroud of kisses. True, the wager was not fair. There were more possibilities of perishing in the attempt than of reaching land. But even so the Aliyah was advantageous, as if they had told him he had 1,000 chances of losing a pitiful sum against one single chance of winning an immense treasure. Who would not accept? Finally he was seized by another idea, which immeasurably reduced for him the risk of this bet, indeed, saw him victor in either eventuality. Assume, then, that the current did carry him in the wrong direction. Well, but once he passed the other promontory, he knew this because of his experiment with the plank, the current would bear him along the meridian. If he were to let himself float, his eyes staring at the sky, he would never again see the sun move. He would drift along that border that separates today from the day before, outside time, in an eternal noon. Stopping time for himself, he would arrest it also on the island, infinitely delay her death, because by now everything that happened to Lilia depended on his narrative decision. If he was suspended, the story of the island would be suspended. A highly acute chiasmus, above all. She would find herself in the same position he had occupied now for an incalculable time, a few yards from the island, and his losing himself in the ocean would make her a gift of what had been his hope, would keep her suspended on the edge of an interminable desire. Both of them without a future and hence without a future death. Then he lingered to picture what his journey would be, and because of the conflation of universes which by now he had sanctioned, he felt as if this was the voyage of Lilia. It was the extraordinary vicissitude of Roberto that would guarantee also for her an immortality that the warp of longitudes would not otherwise have granted her. He would move northwards at a gentle and uniform speed. On his right and on his left the days and nights would follow one another, the seasons, eclipses, tides. Brand new stars would cross the heavens bearing pestilences and upheavals of empires, monarchs and pontiffs would grow old and vanish in puffs of dust. All the vortices of the universe would perform their windy revolutions, more stars would be formed from the holocaust of older ones. Around him the sea would be unleashed and then subdued, the trades would perform their girandoles, and he in his calm furrow would not change at all. Would he stop one day? From what he remembered of the maps, no other land save the island of Solomon lay on that longitude, at least not until that meridian connected with all the others at the pole. But if a ship, with a following wind and a forest of sails, took months and months to travel a course like the one he was undertaking, how long would he last? Perhaps years before arriving at the place where he no longer knew what would become of day and night, or of the passing of centuries. But in the meantime he would repose in a love so much refined that it would be careless of losing eyes, lips, and hands. The body would be drained of all lymph, blood, bile, and phlegm, water would enter every pore. Penetrating the ears, it would varnish his brain with salt, would replace the vitreous humor of his eyes, would invade his nostrils, dissolving every trace of the terrestrial element. At the same time the sun's rays would nourish him with igneous particles, and this would dilute the liquid in a single dew of air and fire that by sympathetic force would be recalled upwards. And he, by now light and volatile, would rise and be united first with the spirits of the air, then with those of the sun. And the same would happen to her, in the steady light of that rock. She would expand like gold to airy thinness beat. Thus in the course of days they would be united in that understanding, instant after instant they would be to each other like the stiff twin compasses, each moving with the motion of its companion, one leaning when the other goes farther, to follow or to return together to the center. Then both would continue their journey in the present, straight towards the star awaiting them, their dust of atoms among the other corpuscles of the cosmos, a vortex among vortices, now eternal is the world because embroidered with void. Reconciled to their fate, because the motion of the earth carries evils and fears, but the trepidation of the spheres is innocent. So in either case the wager will bring him a victory. He should not hesitate, neither should he prepare for that triumphal sacrifice without observing the correct rites. Roberto entrusts to his papers the last actions he intends to make, and for the rest he leaves us to guess deeds, times, cadences. As a first liberating Lavacrum, he spent almost an hour removing a part of the grating that separated the upper deck from the lower. Then he went below and set about opening every cage. As he gradually pulled away the withes, he was struck by a general flapping of wings, and he had to defend himself, raising his arms before his face, but at the same time crying. Shoo shoo. He had to push some clucking hens unable to find an egress on their own. When he climbed back up on deck, he saw the populous flight rise through the rigging, and it seemed to him that for a few seconds the sun was covered by all the colors of the rainbow, striped across their breadth by marine birds who had hastened, curious, to join in this festival. The birds freed, he flung into the sea all the clocks, not thinking for a moment that he was wasting valuable time. He was erasing time to favor a journey against time. Finally, to avert any cowardice in himself, he collected on deck, under the mainmast, logs, planks, empty casks, sprinkled them with the oil of all the lamps, and set fire to them. A first flame blazed up, which immediately licked at the sails and the rigging. When he was certain the fire was being fed by its own strength, he prepared for his farewell. He was still naked, as he had been since he began dying by turning himself to stone. Stripped even of the rope, which would no longer limit his voyage, he descended into the sea. He planted his feet against the wood, thrusting himself forward to move away from the Daphne, and after following the side to the stern, he left it forever, towards one of the two happinesses that were surely awaiting him. Before destiny and the waters decide for him, I hope that, pausing for breath every so often, he allows his eyes to move from the Daphne, as he bids it farewell, to the island. There, above the line traced by the treetops, his eyes now very sharp, he should see rising in flight, like an arrow eager to strike the sun, the orange dove. Colophon. There, and what later happened to Roberto I do not know or think it will ever be known. How to draw a novel from a story, so novelistic, when the end, or, for that matter, the true beginning, is missing. Unless the story to be told is not that of Roberto but of his papers, though here, too, all must be based on conjecture. If the papers, fragmentary, in any case, from which I have devised a story or a series of intersecting or skewed stories, have come down to us, it is because the Daphne did not burn entirely. That much is obvious. Who knows, perhaps the fire barely singed the masts, then died out on that windless day. Or else. There is nothing to prevent us from believing this. A few hours later a torrential rain fell and extinguished the blaze. How long was the Daphne there before someone found it and discovered Roberto's writings? I can venture two hypotheses, both fruit of the imagination. As I have already mentioned, a few months before these events, in February 1643 to be exact, Abel Tasman, having set out from Batavia in August of 1642, then after reaching Van Diemen's Land, later to become Tasmania, seeing New Zealand only from a distance and heading for the Tongas, already reached in 1615 by Shaugden and Lemaire and named the Coconut Islands and the Traders' Islands, then proceeding north, discovered a series of little sand-girt islands, recording them at 17.19 degrees latitude south and 201.35 degrees longitude. We will not go into the matter of longitude here, but those islands, which he named Prins Willems Eilanden, if my hypotheses are correct, should not have been far from the island of our story. Tasman ends his voyage, he says, in June, and hence before the Daphne could have arrived in those parts. But we cannot be sure that Tasman's diaries are reliable, and, indeed, the original no longer exists. Let us try to imagine, then, that through one of those fortuitous detours in which his voyage is so rich, he returned to the area, say in September of that year, and discovered there the Daphne. No hope of repairing it, without sails and rigging as it was by then. He inspected it, to learn its origin, and came upon Roberto's papers. Though his knowledge of Italian was poor, he realized that the papers included some discussion of the problem of longitudes, so they had to be considered highly secret, to be delivered only to the Dutch East India Company. Therefore in his own diary he says nothing about the matter and perhaps falsifies the dates to eliminate traces of his adventure. Thus Roberto's papers end up in some secret archive. Tasman made another voyage the next year, and God only knows where he went. Let us imagine the Dutch geographers leafing through those papers. As we know, there was nothing of interest to be found in them, except perhaps Dr. Bird's canine method, which, I am willing to bet, several spies must have ferreted out already from various sources. There is mention of the Specula melitensis, but we must remember that, after Tasman, 138 years had to go by before Cook rediscovered those islands, which would never have been rediscovered by following Tasman's directions. Then, finally, and a century after our story, Harrison's invention of the marine chronometer puts an end to the frantic search for the Punto Fijo. The problem of longitude is no longer a problem, and some archivist of the company, eager to clear his cupboards, discards, gives away, sells, who knows. Roberto's papers, now a mere curiosity for some maniacal collector of manuscripts. The second hypothesis is more like a novel, enthralling. In May 1789 a fascinating character passes through those parts. He is Captain Bligh, whom the mutineers of the Bounty had loaded into a sloop with 18 loyal men, entrusting them to the mercy of the waves. That exceptional man, whatever his defects of character may have been, manages to sail more than 6,000 kilometers and land finally at Timor. In carrying out this enterprise, he skirts the Fiji archipelago, almost arrives at Vanuatu, and crosses the Usawa group. This means that if he had deviated only slightly to the east, he could easily have landed somewhere around Tabauni, where I like to think our island can be found. And if evidence is to be enlisted in the question of believing or not believing, well, I am assured that an orange dove or flame dove or, better, a Dolichopus victor exists only there. But at the risk of spoiling the whole story, I must add that the orange bird is the male of the species. Now a man like Bligh, if he had found the Daphne in barely reasonable condition, arriving there in a mere sloop, would have done everything possible to put the vessel in shape. But by now almost a century and a half had passed. Some storms had further racked the hull, disanchored it, The ship had keeled over on the coral reef, or no, it had been caught by the current, drawn north, and flung on other shoals or on the rocks of a nearby island, where it lay exposed to the work of time. Probably Bligh boarded a phantom vessel, its bulwarks encrusted with shells, green with seaweed, water stagnating in its riven hold, a refuge of mollusks and poisonous fish. Perhaps, rickety, the quarterdeck survived, and in the captain's cabin, dry and dusty, or no, damp and rotting but still legible, Bligh found Roberto's papers. These were no longer times of great anguish over longitudes, but perhaps he was attracted by the references, in an unknown language, to the islands of Solomon. Almost 10 years earlier, a certain Monsieur Boitier, geographer to the King and of the French Navy, had presented a paper to the Academy of Sciences on the subject of the existence and position of the islands of Solomon, asserting that they were none other than that bay of Choiseul that Bougainville found in 1768, and whose description seemed to conform to the ancient one of Mendagne, and the Terrace des Arsacides found in 1769 by Surville. So while Bligh was still at sea, an anonymous writer, probably Monsieur de Fleurieu, was about to publish a book entitled Découvertes des François en 1768 and 1769 dans le sud-est de la Nouvelle-Guinée. I do not know whether Bligh had read Monsieur Boitier, but surely in the English Navy there was irritated talk of that piece of arrogance on the part of their French cousins, who boasted of having found the unfindable. The French were right, but Bligh might not have known that, or wished it. He could therefore have conceived the hope of having got his hands on a document which not only gave the lie to the French but would proclaim him discoverer of the islands of Solomon. I would imagine that, first, he mentally thanked Fletcher Christian and the other mutineers for having set him brutally on the road to glory. Then he decided, good patriot that he was, to keep quiet with everyone about his little detour eastwards and his discovery, and to deliver the papers to the Admiralty in strictest confidence. But in this case, too, someone must have considered them of little interest, of no value as evidence, and, again, exiled the papers among bundles of erudite rubbish for littérateurs. Bligh gives up the islands of Solomon, is content with being named admiral for his other undeniable virtues as a navigator, and will die equally content, unaware that Hollywood will make him odious to all posterity. And so, if the narrative continued according to either one of my hypotheses, such an end would not be worthy of narration, it would leave every reader discontent and frustrated. In this way Roberto's story would not inspire any moral lesson, and we would still be wondering why what happened to him, concluding that in life things happen because they happen, and it is only in the land of romances that they seem to happen for some purpose or providence. For if I had to draw a conclusion from it, I would go and rummage again among Roberto's papers to find a note, dating surely from those nights when he still worried about a possible intruder. That evening Roberto was looking yet again at the sky. He was remembering how at La Griva, when the family chapel had collapsed with age, that Carmelite tutor of his, who had had experience in the East, advised rebuilding the little chapel in Byzantine style, a round form with a central dome, which had nothing at all to do with the style to which they were accustomed in the Monferrato. And old Pozzo, refusing to stick his nose into matters of art and religion, heeded the advice of the holy man. Seeing the antipodal sky, Roberto realized that at La Griva, in a landscape surrounded on every side by hills, the heavenly vault appeared to him like the dome of the chapel, clearly defined by the brief circle of the horizon, with one or two constellations that he could identify. So while he knew that the spectacle changed from one week to the next, he never realized, since he went to sleep early, that it changed even in the course of the same night. And therefore that dome had always seemed to him stable and round, and consequently he conceived the universe as stable and round. At Casale, in the center of a plain, he saw that the sky was more vast than he had believed, but Padre Emanuele convinced him to imagine the stars as described by concepts rather than to look at those above his head. Now, antipodal spectator of the infinite expanse of an ocean, he saw a boundless horizon rise. And above his head he observed constellations never seen before. Those of his hemisphere he had read according to patterns others had established, here the polygonal symmetry of the Wain, there the alphabetic exactitude of Cassiopeia. But on the Daphne he had no pre-established patterns, he could join any point to any other, derive the outlines of a serpent, a giant, locks of hair, or the tail of a poisonous insect, and then dismantle them and essay other forms. In France and Italy he observed even in the sky a landscape defined by the hand of a monarch who had fixed the lines of the postal services and the roads, leaving between them stands of forest. Here, on the contrary, Roberto was a pioneer in an unknown land, and he had to decide by which paths he would connect a peak to a lake, without any criterion of choice, because there were not yet cities and villages on the slopes of the one or on the shores of the other. Roberto did not simply gaze at the constellations, he was obliged to define them. He was alarmed that the whole was disposed as a spiral, a snail shell, a vortex. It is at this point that he recalls a church, quite new, seen in Rome, and this is the only time he allows us to imagine that he has visited that city, perhaps before his journey to Provence. The church seemed to him very different both from the dome at La Griva and from the naves, geometrically arranged in ogives and cross vaults, of the churches at Casale. Now he understood why. It was as if the vault of that church were an austral sky, which lured the eyes to essay ever new lines of flight, never resting on a central point. Wherever you stood under that cupola, when you looked up, you felt always at the edge. He realized now that in a less specific, less obviously theatrical fashion, experienced through little surprises day after day, This sensation of repose denied was something he had known first in Provence, then in Paris, where everyone he encountered somehow destroyed a certitude of his, each proposing a different map of the world, but the various proposals never cohered into a finite design. He heard of machines that could alter the order of natural phenomena, so what was heavy rose and what was light sank, so that fire would moisten and water burn, as if the very creator of the universe were capable of revising himself and could finally compel plants and flowers to disobey the seasons, and the seasons to engage in a struggle with time. If the creator consented to change his mind, did an order that he had imposed on the universe still exist? Perhaps he had imposed many, from the beginning, perhaps he was prepared to change them day by day, perhaps a secret order existed, presiding over the constant change of orders and perspectives, but we were destined never to discover it, to follow instead the shifting play of those appearances of order that were reordered at every new experience. Then the story of Roberto della Griva would be merely the tale of an unhappy lover, condemned to live beneath an exaggerated sky, a man unable to reconcile himself to the idea that the earth wandered along an ellipse of which the sun was only one of the fires. Which, as many will agree, is too little to make a story with a proper beginning and a proper end. Finally, if from this story I wanted to produce a novel, I would demonstrate once again that it is impossible to write except by making a palimpsest of a rediscovered manuscript, without ever succeeding in eluding the anxiety of influence. Nor could I elude the childish curiosity of the reader, who would want to know if Roberto really wrote the pages on which I have dwelt far too long. In all honesty, I would have to reply that it is not impossible that someone else wrote them, someone who wanted only to pretend to tell the truth. And thus I would lose all the effect of the novel, where, yes, you pretend to tell true things, but you must not admit seriously that you are pretending. I would not even know how to come up with a final event whereby these letters fell into the hands of him who presumably gave them to me, extracting them from a miscellany of other defaced and faded manuscripts. The author is unknown, I would, however, expect him to say. The writing is graceful, but as you see, it is discolored, and the pages are covered with water stains. As for the contents, from the little I have seen, they are mannered exercises. You know how they wrote in that century. People with no soul. Translators postscript. Many people, the author, first of all, have been of inestimable help in the preparation of this English text. I would like in particular to thank Nicholas Adams of Vassar College and Silvio Bedini of the Smithsonian Institution. I am indebted to my colleagues at Bard College, Elizabeth Frank, Daniel Friedman, Frederick Hammond, William Mullen, and Hope Canecci, to Pietro Corsi of the Nuova Rivista dei Libri, Florence, Antonio Claricuzio of the Università di Cassino, Mara Miniati of the Museo di Storia della Scienza, Florence, and Valentina Passanti and Alastair McEwen, Milan. This translation is dedicated to the cherished memory of Francis Steegmuller. W.W. Footnotes. 1. The reader can easily verify the truth of what I have written by consulting P.A. Loop, De Handschriften der Antikingries van A.J. Tasman and Francois Jacobson Visch 1642-5, in Bijdragen voor Vaderlandse Geschiedene en Oudheidkunde, NR 7, 1872, greater than. No objection can be made, surely, to the documents collected as General Missiven, including an extract from the Dagregister van het Kasteel Batavia, dated the 10th of June 1643, in which Tasman's return is reported. But my hypothesis is still plausible, for it would be easy to suppose that in order to maintain a secret like that of longitude, even a document of this sort would be manipulated. With communications that from Batavia had to reach Holland, and there is no telling when they arrived there, a gap of 2 months would pass unnoticed. Moreover, I am not at all sure Roberto arrived in the area in August and not earlier. Back. Asterisk. 2. Absolutely no log or documentation of this voyage exists. Why? Back.